If it's Monday, Blinken in Beijing. America's top diplomat meets with Chinese President Xi Jinping, pledging to stabilize U.S.-China relations in the administration's most significant effort yet to ease tensions and strengthen economic ties. Plus, on the road again, President Biden ramps up his re-election effort, holding his first campaign rally, while polls show a federal indictment has not put the brakes on Trump's dominance in the Republican primary field. And Juneteenth and the fight for freedom as America celebrates the newest federal holiday commemorating the end of slavery. We'll look at this country's ongoing fight for racial equality. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington. We begin with the high-level, high-stakes meeting today in Beijing between U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Secretary Blinken's trip to China was the first by any U.S. Secretary of State in 5 years, and it comes after months of escalating tensions between the two global superpowers. Following his 35-minute meeting with President Xi, Secretary Blinken characterized discussions as candid and substantive, and yet there were no major breakthroughs. Blinken said both sides agreed on the need to stabilize relations, but he acknowledged the complicated geopolitical circumstances.
We have no illusions about the challenges of managing this relationship. There are many issues on which we profoundly, even vehemently, disagree. We will always take the best course of action to advance the interests of the American people. But the United States has a long history of successfully managing complicated, consequential relationships through diplomacy. It's the responsibility of both countries to find a path forward, and it's in both our interests and the interests of the world that we do so.
Now, remember, Secretary Blinken's trip was originally scheduled for February, but was postponed after a Chinese spy balloon was spotted flying across the U.S. Since that incident, relations between Washington and Beijing continue to crumble, including multiple close military encounters in both the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. But despite that, today's talks in Beijing ended with no progress on reestablishing vital military-to-military communication channels. Here's what Secretary Blinken told our Janice Mackey-Frayer following his meetings.
What about the lines of communication between militaries? There have been close calls. How dangerous is it that you're leaving Beijing without direct assurances that these lines of communication will open when the tactics appear to be growing bolder?
It's imperative for us, and it really should be for them, to restore these military-to-military channels of communication for exactly the reason that you cited. We've seen a couple of very dangerous incidents in the last couple of weeks with their ships driving much too close to ours, their planes doing the same thing. That's the quickest path to an inadvertent conflict. I don't have any progress to report on reestablishing the military-to-military channels. I can say that they understand very clearly the importance we attach to this.
So big questions remain. What happens next? Will these candid talks open the door to a Biden-Xi meeting? And could this be the start of a thaw between the U.S. and China? Joining me now, live from Beijing, is NBC foreign correspondent Janice Mackey-Frayer, who interviewed Secretary Blinken. NBC's Monica Alba is outside the White House. And also joining us is Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group and author of The Power of Crisis. He also just released a new TED Talk on the next global superpower and the evolving global order. So, Janice, I want to start with you. Extraordinary interview. What was your biggest takeaway?
The Secretary of State came into the visit with very low expectations. U.S. officials were telling us that the key objective was to try to stop this downward spiral in relations. Remember, the relationship wasn't great before that Chinese balloon was shot down, and it had deteriorated to a point that even China's foreign minister said was at the lowest valley that relations had been in since relations between the two countries had started. So the fact that the visit actually went ahead was seen as a key step. They were positive when they were getting on the plane to go on to London. Chinese officials seemed positive as well. There were some terse readouts in the first day or so, but that meeting today with Xi Jinping, which was confirmed only an hour before it happened, seemed to signal that the visit had gone well enough to cap it off with this 35-minute meeting with China's president. What it will also do is pave the way for more visits, expecting more cabinet members from the Biden administration to come here, namely the Commerce and Treasury secretaries, who will be very welcome in China, given the state of the economy here right now.
Yeah, and Janice, obviously one of the angles that we're following to all of this, the concerns about the revelations of the Chinese spy facility in Cuba. What did Blinken have to say about that? How concerned is the U.S. about that revelation?
Well, I asked him if he raised it in his meetings. He said, of course, he brought it up with Chinese officials. But I also asked whether he was willing to dismiss a Chinese spy base on Cuba as just a normal part of their bilateral relationship now. He said they're certainly keeping an eye on it. It is a matter of concern. He said it's something they've known about and have been very forthcoming about. But they are also keeping an eye on whether China wants to make more than a spy base on Cuba, with the potential for moving in military assets there.
And Janice, just finally, what has the reaction been in China to this meeting between Secretary Blinken and Xi?
Well, to be truthful, for the first day or so with the meetings with the senior Chinese officials, people were not particularly interested. It wasn't generating a lot of attention on social media. And then at 4:30 local time today, when that meeting with Xi Jinping happened, social media just exploded. And by the end of the day, the Secretary of State's visit was generating close to 1 billion views on Chinese social media platforms. So there really was the sense that this visit went well. It was important to a lot of Chinese netizens that it was the U.S. coming to China. There was this sense that the Secretary of State was having to make amends for postponing or calling off that visit after the spy balloon was shot down. So there was overall a sense that a mission was accomplished of sorts, in that this downward spiral in relations has been stopped, at least for now.
It certainly is a significant step. Janice Mackey-Freyer, I know it has been a long day or a long couple of days for you. Again, congratulations on the interview. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Monica, I want to turn to you. You and I have been doing so much reporting on whether President Biden's going to meet with President Xi, when he's going to meet with President Xi. What has the reaction been from the White House, and what does this meeting between Blinken and Xi mean for a potential Biden-Xi meeting?
Well, Kristen, it certainly signals that that meeting could become closer and closer to reality sometime later this year, even potentially. The White House today called this meeting today between the Secretary of State and the Chinese president a good step forward, which is significant when you consider that just a couple of weeks ago, there was really this war of words between the two nations after those acts of aggression you saw at sea and in the air. And it was even the U.S. that was warning if there was a conflict, if this escalated. The Chinese was responding, saying that that would bring unbearable pain on the world. So we really saw how high stakes this got in terms of the communication breakdown. That was the key thing here that the president and the White House really were hoping to try to improve, given the fact that over the last few months, communications were at an extremely low point after that Chinese spy balloon incident. And so that is why you had everything from diplomatic channels trying to restore the talks, and then you saw this high-level diplomacy that really just unfolded over the course of this weekend, and some other officials who had been in China earlier in the month to try to see if this meeting could become reality. The fact that the trip was delayed and ultimately was able to take place now does signal and lay the groundwork for a potential meeting between the U.S. and Chinese presidents. And I'm told it could happen still on the sidelines of a major summit later this year. So it's unclear, will there be a a phone call first. It's possible that that could happen. There could be a sort of virtual discussion building on some of the things they talked about last fall on the sidelines of the G20 in Bali. And so when we're talking about later in the year, they could come face to face again, or it's even possible that we could see them meet elsewhere if things continue in this positive direction, at least. In the White House, waiting for Secretary Blinken to really come give the president a full debrief of how everything went with this trip, Kristen.
All right, NBC's Monica Alba at the White House. Monica, thank you so much for your great reporting, as always. Ian Bremmer, let me turn to you. Obviously, the expectations for this meeting were pretty low, but the fact that Secretary Blinken met with China's president is significant in and of itself. What is your biggest takeaway from what happened today?
That the diplomacy is good and the relationship is bad. I mean, there's no question if you compare this to when Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken were first meeting their Chinese counterparts in Anchorage, and the Chinese lectured at the Americans and stormed off. This was a much better trip, no question. But you have the Chinese engaging in the last several weeks in very assertive, even belligerent military activities towards the Americans in the Straits of Taiwan, in the South China Sea, and still refusing to re-engage in high-level military-to-military contacts for the two countries. You see the Americans having changed the status quo, not diplomatically, but the real status quo between the U.S. and China, in saying that Taiwan is not going to matter as much anymore, that there are big export controls on Taiwanese semiconductors, and meanwhile, massive investment away from Taiwan into the United States, into American allies. So the Americans may be saying that they're not pushing Taiwanese independence, but they are structurally trying to make Taiwan as unimportant as possible, changing that status quo from China's perspective. Neither of those two things are likely to change in the next couple months. So I do think that we're going to see a Xi Jinping meeting with Biden. We might see a quick Zoom call. It's very likely, if there isn't a crisis, that Xi will come to San Francisco for the APEC summit, where Biden intends to be for 2 days in the fall. But none of that is really changing the reality that this relationship is fraught with conflict. There is zero trust in it, and it's actually quite dangerous.
Yeah, and there has been, I think, a lot of talk about a potential meeting on the sidelines of the summit that you mentioned, Ian. Really good point there. What do you make of the fact that China and the U.S. said today that they are not having military-to-military communication channels reopened yet? How significant is that to basically not allowing this thaw to move forward?
Well, it's a lever. And it's one of the few things that the Chinese have that the Americans really want, that it's fairly easy for them to continue to take away. And the Americans have been pressing on this. I mean, as you probably know, the military-to-military contacts really stopped after Nancy Pelosi went to Taipei last fall. This was despite the fact that Biden really didn't want her to go. But the Americans were quite surprised when the U.S. put those export controls on semiconductors going to China. They were surprised that the Chinese didn't do very much in response, that there wasn't a tit-for-tat sanctioning against the Americans. There wasn't much the Chinese felt like they could do. Well, here we have something that the Americans want that the Chinese are not offering. And I think China's response is, if you're not going to play ball with us on export controls and what we consider a level playing field, we're not going to play ball with you. We're willing to tolerate more danger in the relationship. It's not exactly linkage because they're in very different areas of the relationship, but they see it from the same perspective.
There's obviously been a lot of focus on the tariffs that were imposed under former President Trump. Do you expect any movement on that? Do you think that the president is considering lifting some of those tariffs?
He was considering it. In fact, there was a report that I remember the Secretary of Treasury gave to Biden, was asked by the White House of how much would it reduce inflation if the Trump-era tariffs on the U.S. and China were removed, in other words, and then it was reciprocal from the Chinese. And the response was about 1% off of inflation. Now, of course, this was back when inflation was a lot higher and was considered to be a very significant problem for Biden's popularity and for the U.S. economy. Now, if he was unwilling to do it then, because he would be pilloried as being too soft on China, particularly by the Republicans in the House and Senate, he's certainly not going to do it now when inflation feels more manageable, more under control, less of an urgent political crisis.
Let me ask you, one interesting point from the interview, I thought, is that Secretary Blinken told Janice Mackey-Frayer that the Chinese spy balloon chapter should be closed. Do you agree with that? What's your assessment?
Well, they didn't want it to be opened. Let's keep in mind that the Americans knew that the balloon was coming over the United States well before it was noticed by members of the public and then blew up in the internet and on the media. And at that point, they were still fully intending to send Tony Blinken to China to meet with Xi Jinping. And it was only when it became public that suddenly the chapter was opened. It was only when it became public that suddenly it became imperative to shoot the balloon down. I fully expect the Chinese are going to continue with their balloon surveillance program. The purpose of it is to have a backup that's not as effective as their satellite-based surveillance, but in case the Americans in a conflict were to blow up China's capabilities, they have something they can continue to watch and engage. You've, of course, seen the recent headlines on China's surveillance program with a base in Cuba, which first the Biden administration was a little wishy-washy on, squirrely, and then they said, well, actually, it's been going on since 2019. Read since the Trump administration. I mean, is that chapter closed? This is not something they want to talk about, but it is, in reality, another area of tit for tat between the Americans and Chinese. Let's be very clear. The Chinese have far greater surveillance capabilities. The Americans have far greater surveillance capabilities of the Chinese surrounding and above China than anything the Chinese can put in the field right now.
All right. Ian Bremmer, thank you so much for joining us on a very busy day. Appreciate it. Coming up, Decision 2024 candidates hit the campaign trail this holiday weekend with President Biden making his re-election rally debut as the Republicans decide how to take on Trump, if at all. Plus, on this Juneteenth holiday, we're taking a deep dive into the controversial conversation about reparations and what it means for the debate over equality and racial justice nationwide. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. A holiday weekend means plenty of campaigning for the top 2024 presidential candidates. President Biden held his first big re-election event Saturday, appearing with union workers in Philadelphia. That's about as friendly of an audience and the location as it gets for him. Looking to make up ground in early primary states, Ron DeSantis made a swing through Nevada, a state where Donald Trump has dominated the Republican Party. And just about everywhere there was a camera, Republican presidential candidates were asked about former President Trump's latest indictment and if they would pardon him if elected president. Chuck asked the question to Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence on Meet the Press. Here's his response.
I just think the question is premature. I think we need to let the courts do their job and let this case work its way through our judicial system. And if I have the great privilege of being President of the United States, as I did when I was a governor, we would evaluate any request for pardon for any American on the same foundation.
NBC's Ali Vitale is on the trail with Nikki Haley in the candidate's home state of South Carolina. So, Ali, give us the big takeaways today. Nikki Haley obviously said she was inclined to favor a pardon for former President Trump, even though she had some pretty critical words for him just a day before she said that. So where is she today? And talk about the broader strategy of some of these candidates.
Well, look, for Haley, she's not talking about Donald Trump today, and she's not talking about the indictment. For some of the voters that I caught up with, that's okay with them. But for others, they want to hear her find ways to draw contrasts with the former president, because some of these voters that I spoke to today think it's time for the party to move past. When they hear her say things like a new generational leader, they like the sound of that, and they do want to move forward. Of course, that's not what the polling tells us every Republican primary voter wants, but certainly those are the
kinds of voters that Haley is trying to appeal to before she starts going a layer deeper in Republican primary voters and trying to tackle those who are already loyal to the former president. Especially, though, in this state of South Carolina, Trump looms so large, but not for all voters, especially not some of the ones that I talked to here, including this woman. Watch what she told me when I asked her if this was still Trump country.
It is Trump country, but I think it's something that people need to put on the back burner. It's moving forward, like leave that there and look at new ideas. And I think that's one thing Nikki Haley's done well with this whole time. She didn't mention her affiliation with Trump. She didn't mention that she stood behind him and all these things. She's setting herself away from that, and I think to be successful, that's what everyone needs to do.
So this voter might not want her to engage with that question, Kristen, but certainly others do, and frankly, many reporters do as well. And we've seen Haley engage with this question in a variety of ways, saying that, especially as a military spouse, watching the way that he allegedly handled this sensitive information meant that he was, in her words, reckless with national security. Of course, Haley's husband just deployed for a year-long tour in Africa just this morning, she said. But at the same time, she's also said, as you mentioned, that she would pardon him if she were elected and he were actually found guilty, because she doesn't think that's good for the country. So certainly by no means is she going directly at her top competitor, even when she is talking about him.
Well, it's a really fascinating interview that you did there with that voter. Says a lot. Ali Vitale, thank you so much for that. Joining me now on set is Tia Mitchell, Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Democratic pollster and NBC political analyst Cornell Belcher, and Brendan Buck, former advisor to House Speaker John Boehner and Paul Ryan. He's also an NBC News political analyst. Great to have all of you here on a very busy Monday. Brendan, I want to start by playing what we heard from Trump's former Attorney General, Bill Barr, who has been speaking out quite a bit. Take a listen. We'll do some analysis.
The fact of the matter is, he is a consummate narcissist, and he constantly engages in reckless conduct that puts his political followers at risk and the conservative and Republican agenda at risk. He's a very petty individual who will always put his interests ahead of the country's, his personal gratification of his, of his ego. But our country can't be a therapy session for, a troubled man like this.
Tia, what do you make of what we heard from the former Attorney General, I should say?
Well, I think he's speaking his truth. I think it's always interesting that all of these former Trump folks speak their truth once they've fallen out of favor, once they've created a lot of distance. These weren't truths that were spoken when they were in the White House in real time. And so I think that makes it harder for Republicans at large to accept these truths that people like Bill Barr are saying. And I think that creates a lot of skepticism from Democrats and those who wish they had seen this side of Bill Barr when perhaps there could have been more response in real time when Trump was still in power. That being said, it's very strong language still, very strong language, very damning for those who are paying attention, but I don't know if Republicans are.
I mean, Brendan, if you look at the polls, it's not having any impact. I mean, his poll numbers, Trump's poll numbers seem to keep going up. But what do you make of the former Attorney General's criticism and sharp words?
Yeah, it shows that you could do that. Someone can point out what's going on here. None of the people who are actually running against him seem to be willing to do that. I mean, write that down, folks. Look, all of these candidates, Mike Pence included, seem very eager to get past this moment, get past this news cycle. The problem is that just returns you to a situation where you're losing by 30 or 40 points to the former president. I mean, this is going to be one of the biggest moments this entire primary. There will be other big things, I'm sure, but few bigger than the former president being indicted in the way that he was. They missed the opportunity. They want to get past it. I don't know. It'd be one thing if they were articulating another way, another path to defeating him, but I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah.
So
no, we certainly haven't. Yeah. That's for sure. Cornell, to Brendan's point, a new NPR poll shows 83% of Republicans still want former President Trump to run for president. 64% of them say they'll likely support him if he continues to run, regardless of the indictment. How durable is his lead? I mean, to Brendan's point, is there anything that his Republican challengers can do? What if they all started piling on? Would that make a difference?
Look, I'm going to double down on my point my friend made here. I once worked for a guy by the name Obama who was behind Hillary Clinton by 30 points. Of course, he didn't overcome that by defending her. He overcame that by having a contrast. I don't know a lot about much but I do know a little bit about primaries and races. And you are never going to get ahead of the person in front of you if you keep supporting that person and rallying to that person's defense in front of you. It seems to me that there are a lot of people running for second place because none of them, except for maybe Chris Christie, is acting like he's running to take Donald Trump out.
One of the things that we are starting to see emerge, though, Ron DeSantis, for example, Mike Pence, is this effort to run to the right of former President Trump. Tia, is that something that could start to chip away some of his support in some areas?
Well, I think when you think about conventional wisdom, it seems like it would be effective because we know that Republicans want someone who's going to push those conservative policies, who's going to continue to get conservative jurists on the court. But Donald Trump has always defied that conventional wisdom. I don't think even in 2016, when he was first elected, he was always squishy on policy. And so I don't know if running to his right is going to necessarily be winning just against Donald Trump with this current kind of posture, how the Republican Party really is Trump's party. So there are a lot of Republican voters that want to support Trump as a personality, as a person, not so much as this political standard bearer.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's not so much what he's for, but it's how he makes people feel. And he gets people excited, and they like that he's a fighter. And all of the things that we talk about with him, he could bring emotion out of him, and that's what motivates people to come out and vote. And the problem for any of these other people is getting that same kind of energy, to get people fired up for them. But it's also to get Donald Trump, to get the attention away from Donald Trump. He is a showman. He blocks out the sun. He's what we talk about. And the rest of them are really struggling to capture people's imagination.
But look, I'm gonna give you this for free, although I get paid for this. I think I think you've already touched on it. It's time to turn the page. This whole idea of a new generation of leaders who can carry the mantle right now, and the idea that Donald Trump is not electable. So this electability is a big thing for primary voters, both on the left and right. Look, Biden is in office right now, arguably because he made the best case that I'm the best candidate to beat Donald Trump. I think there's an argument to be made here that Donald Trump, we can't get the job done with Donald Trump.
And you have to be explicit. Yeah. A lot of implicit criticisms.
Because you are seeing a lot of subtle criticisms, not mentioning him by name,
and Donald Trump has thrived on implicit criticisms for a long time. Yes. I think we need to turn the page on implicit.
And I was going to say, on the electability, that's why we keep hearing about Senator Tim Scott. They think he's one of the most electable candidates in the GOP primary. But he's not considered, the second place, he's not considered the runner-up right now to Trump. That's Ron DeSantis. And Ron DeSantis has an electability issue he would face should he become the Republican nominee. I'm not saying he couldn't win, but he's not necessarily seen as someone who could be electable in a general election.
And he's someone who's walking a very fine line with all of his comments right now. Someone who's not, though, who's taken the gloves off, Chris Christie, former New Jersey governor. Let me play you what he had to say, basically thumbing his nose at taking the Republican pledge to support the nominee, which is a requirement of getting on the RNC debate stage. Take a look.
So if Donald Trump is the nominee, will you pledge to support him and vote for him, even if he's a convicted felon?
Jake, I'm going to go back to 2016 again and say I'm going to take the pledge just as seriously as Donald Trump took it in 2016.
What do you make of the fact that the RNC is not allowing a carve-out even if the candidate and the nominee has been convicted of a felony?
Look, I think the pledge is just a useless idea, Jake.
Brendan, what do you make of that?
Well, it should be obvious that this is the kind of thing you should be talking about, and he shouldn't be standing alone. I think there is strength in numbers, and if more people were talking like Chris Christie, you actually might see his numbers starting to change. I don't know if Christie's appeal, I don't know if Christie has what it takes to win this nomination, but I think he is certainly helping some of these other people who may have that chance.
And I think it shows that the Republican Party is worried that, again, we know that there are a lot of Republicans who support Donald Trump. Right now, it looks like enough for him to become their nominee. But there are still a sizable amount of Republican voters, independent voters, who could potentially support a third-party candidate if Trump is the Republican nominee. And that's what the Republican Party doesn't want, just like the Democrats don't want someone running as a third party who could siphon votes away from Joe Biden.
Speaking of the Democrats and Joe Biden, Cornell, obviously President Biden out on the campaign trail in Philadelphia. Do you think he's waiting too late to get in? I mean, obviously he's not in a primary, but Do you think he should be campaigning more vigorously, given how far ahead Donald Trump is in the polls?
No, are you kidding me? Why get in the way of this news cycle? Why get in the way of constant news cycle where Republicans are being asked the questions about Donald Trump's indictment and whether or not they will support him? Why on earth would the White House want to get in the way of that? That is fine. This fight right now is between the Republicans, and they're dominating the conversation, and they're dominating the conversation with negative news about Donald Trump. If you are Mitch McConnell or Speaker McCarthy, you're looking at this news cycle when you can get no messaging out, when nothing that you're trying to do is getting out to the American people, and you have to be completely frustrated. No, the president shouldn't get in the way of this at all.
All right. Great Monday conversation. Thank you all, Tia, Cornell, and Brendan. Really appreciate it. Coming up next, historian Lonnie Bunch joins us on this Juneteenth. Here's a moment from today's celebrations in Queens, New York, where one New Yorker was asked what today means to her.
Juneteenth means victory. It means Black pride. It means celebration. It means happiness. It means love. It means joy for our Black community.
Welcome back. Communities around the country today are celebrating Juneteenth. It marks the day enslaved African Americans in Galveston, Texas, learned they'd be freed. Nearly 2 months after the end of the Civil War and more than 2 years after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The holiday has been celebrated as far back as the late 1800s, but it wasn't until 2021 that President Biden signed a bill to make the day a federal holiday. At the same time, some states are now examining the best way to right historical wrongs perpetrated against Black Americans, including the question of whether America should pay reparations to Black citizens for hundreds of years of slavery, Jim Crow, and other forms of institutional racism. Earlier this month, New York passed a bill to create a commission to consider reparations, and California's reparations task force is set to share its recommendations at the end of the month. NBC's Ron Allen examined the debate over reparations on the latest episode of Meet the Press Reports. Take a listen.
So you've traced your ancestors back to slavery?
Yes, on my father's side.
An attorney with expertise in international reparations. Moore walked us through the task force's draft report, starting with a history lesson about California, a free state when it entered the Union in 1850.
A lot of people don't know that there were over 2,500 enslaved Black people in the state of California.
Men and women brought west by Southerners during the gold rush and forced to work in the mines. Why do you think that Black Californians should receive reparations?
We're owed reparations for the debt owed from slavery due to the broken promise of Reconstruction in this country and the lingering badges and incidents or systemic discrimination that African Americans still face today.
How much generational wealth do you think has been lost?
When you say how much, what do you mean? A dollar figure?
It's
priceless. I'm a homeowner. I shouldn't have to pay property taxes. I should have free medical insurance. I should be able to go to the school that I want to go to without having to pay.
You can watch the whole episode of Meet the Press Reports, The Battle Over Reparations, on demand right now on Peacock and YouTube. And joining me now on this Juneteenth is Lonnie Bunch, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. He was also, of course, the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Lonnie, thank you so much for being with us on this Juneteenth. It means so much.
It's always so great to be with you. So excited.
Thank you. I want to get your reaction to what we just heard from Ron's report. And you heard him there say that California wants to basically be the blueprint for reparations.
I think reparations is a really interesting issue because on the one hand, there's no denying that the economic success of America was built on slavery. And there's no denying that people really didn't reap the benefits of becoming free. For me, reparations is really about education. I'm less interested in, what percentage each person gets, but is there a way to sort of create opportunities to make sure African Americans have access to education? Because clearly that's the transformative part of our nation.
And here we are as we await this Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. The backdrop as you make that comment, I mean, how do you make education more available to communities of color, people who need better access?
I mean, in many ways, you've put your finger on the real challenge, and that is we know what education means, what opportunities, what doors it opens. But what's clear is that for many people of color, still they don't have access or they don't have the support to get through 4 years of college, for example. So for me, this is really pivotal because this is not just shaping today, it's shaping future generations' access to the American dream.
And part of what, of course, we talk about when we talk about things like access and economic opportunity are concerns about ongoing systemic racism. Where are we in that conversation? Where are we in raising awareness about it?
Well, for me, Juneteenth is an important holiday because it's the first holiday that focuses on freedom. And that you really have to understand the struggle for freedom, the challenge of freedom, the fragility of freedom. And this holiday allows us to do that. But the other side of it is that it really makes us look at what is the lack of freedom. It makes us look at slavery in a clear, candid way. It also makes us look at the enduring legacy of racism. The fact that our neighborhoods and cities are shaped by hundreds of years of decisions. In some ways, I find it fascinating that as Americans, we're comfortable recognizing that our grandparents and our great-grandparents' DNA shapes who we are today, but not their history that they experienced. So for me, this is an opportunity to help people understand that history is as much about today and tomorrow as it is about yesterday.
You know, it's so important that you say that. When we mark Martin Luther King and commemorate him and his legacy, on that day, we always say it's a day on, not a day off. This is only the third Juneteenth being celebrated as a federal holiday. Do you think that that message has gotten out about this day as well, that this is a day of reflection, of learning, of participation, of everything that you're talking about?
I think right now, we're still seeing it as a great celebration. But what I want to see is that the other side of that coin is really reflecting. I'd love for people, for example, to grapple with slavery a little better. You know, I wish I was as brave and as strong as my enslaved ancestors. I want everybody to feel that way. I would like people to think about what is the continuing legacy of discrimination and racism. And the fact that in some ways, what this holiday should help us do, it should help us define reality and still give hope to future generations.
Do you think that our federal leaders have done a good enough job of shining a light on this day, its significance, and the ways in which we should be focused on everything that you're discussing right now?
Well, I think the challenge is that it's hard for Americans to grapple with the dark side of their history. And so I think it's important for policymakers to use this day as an opportunity to make a country better, to make the argument that by looking back, we're not simply looking at guilt and fault. What we're really doing is saying, look at the changes in America and how that changes has made a country closer to live up to its stated ideals. And now the challenge is to continue to do that and to use this day, to use a candid conversation around slavery, around racism, to move a country forward.
Lonnie, finally, I talked about the fact that we are awaiting the Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action. If it is struck down, what is the significance and what do you hope to see moving forward to make sure that communities of color, that underserved communities, still have access to higher education?
Well, what I think will happen regardless is that you will see African-American communities come together with their political allies to push for change, to demand fairness, because in some ways the history of America is really a history of people, African-Americans, sort of helping a country live up to its ideals. And so regardless of the decision, I would argue you'll still see that struggle to say, let America be the America it says it will be.
Lonnie Bunch, it is great to talk to you any day of the week, but especially on such an important day as this. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
After the break, the fight for evangelical voters in all-important Iowa, we've got part of Chuck's interview with presidential hopeful Mike Pence that you haven't seen yet. You're going to want to stick around for that. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Evangelical Christians are a potent force inside the Republican Party. Arguably nowhere is that power more evident than in the Iowa caucuses. Each of the last 3 contested Iowa Republican caucuses was won by a candidate who specifically targeted evangelical Christians. Mike Huckabee in 2008, Rick Santorum in 2012, and Ted Cruz in 2016. This time around, we have at least 3 candidates making an overt appeal to evangelicals in Iowa, including former Vice President Mike Pence. As part of Chuck's interview for this Sunday's Meet the Press, he spoke to Pence about his outreach to evangelicals and how they fit into the Republican Party of Donald Trump.
I spoke with Russell Moore recently. It was happened to be right after the E. Jean Carroll verdict came out, the defamation, where the former president was found liable of defamation. And he was very disturbed that the former president's character doesn't seem to matter to evangelical voters now. Why do you think that is?
You know, frankly, we went through 8 years under President Barack Obama, where people that hold traditional values, people that cherish religious liberty, people that believe in the conservative agenda, felt put upon one after another. We saw the slowest economic recovery since the Great Depression, and Donald Trump stepped forward and he gave voice to that frustration. I was proud to run with him in 2016, proud to deliver for the American people for 4 years. But now here we are again. And under President Joe Biden, there's not only the failures abroad, the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, the policies at home that have launched the worst inflation in 40 years, a crisis on our southern border, but also, Chuck, what people feel is a steady assault on their liberties and their values. All of that, I think, is continuing to focus the mind of traditional conservative Americans, including people of strong religious convictions, that we have to win this country back. I understand the affection for my former running mate. I understand.
You do. You understand why people of faith look to him and his behavior as something to rally around?
Look, we couldn't take 8 years of Hillary Clinton after 8 years of Barack Obama, and Christian and evangelical voters, me included, saw in Donald Trump a champion who could carry that forward. But look, I think different times call for different leadership, and I have to tell you, my campaign's only about a week old, Chuck.
Okay.
But we're getting a lot of encouragement around the country. We're going to carry a message of who we are as a family. We're going to carry a message of our faith, our convictions. We're going to talk about our experience, and I believe with all my heart I'm going to be the Republican nominee and the next president of the United States.
Joining me now is Amy Walter, publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report. Amy, thank you for being here.
So glad to be here.
Good to see you. Let me ask you the same question that Chuck just asked Pence. I mean, why does it seem like these issues of character matter less as it relates to former President Trump when you're talking about evangelical voters?
I mean, he answered that actually quite honestly, which is to say character doesn't really matter that much. What matters more is what you can deliver for a group of voters who believes they've been put upon. I can't remember which interview I listened to. This was early in the Trump era when he was president, and it was an interview with an evangelical leader who was very skeptical of Donald Trump when he was a candidate. But as he went through those years of his presidency, became more attached to him. And this interviewer said, well, you know, you had George W. Bush was an actual born-again evangelical who you did not think very highly of. And now you have Donald Trump, who has all of these controversies around character, who you think more highly of. And he basically said, well, Donald Trump has delivered for us. He's delivered on the issues that really matter to us. And so I think that is essentially the challenge here for Mike Pence, is he has to say, I'm one of you. So come and vote for me, who's one of you. I have the character that Donald Trump doesn't, but I also recognize that it's not as important. So selling my character isn't going to be as important as selling what I was able to accomplish in my time as vice president.
And what's so fascinating is you are seeing Pence, you're seeing DeSantis try to start to make this argument that they are further to the right of Donald Trump. Will that work, Amy? I mean, is that going to be enough to peel away voters in Iowa?
Isn't this fascinating?
Yes.
What's so different, I feel like, this election from 2016, where you had so much confidence among Republican strategists was, this is going to work. This is how we're going to beat Donald Trump. Now, I think a lot of his rivals are just saying, I don't know, Kristen, is it going to work?
Right.
But it's all that we have right now because he's still got such a hold on the voting bloc of Republicans. Fundamentally, I think the challenge right now is that Republicans who may be looking around for an alternative haven't been particularly inspired by what they see thus far.
Yeah.
And that is, there's nobody who has that sort of appeal that is enough for them to say, you know what, I'm going to take a chance on this candidate.
Yeah, you know, it's going to be fascinating to see, as you have said before, what happens in the debate stage.
That's
and
right.
if they sharpen their knives.
Yeah.
Let me play a little bit more of Chuck's interview, get your response on the other side.
Look, in 2016, Donald Trump promised to govern as a conservative. And I'm proud to say that we did for 4 years under the Trump-Pence administration. But he makes no such promise today. Not only has he been walking away from a clear commitment to the right to life, but look, we have a national debt the size of our nation's economy. Donald Trump's position on the national debt is identical to Joe Biden's.
What do you make of that? I mean, it's kind of fascinating. Basically saying he's changed who he is.
That's right.
Trump is not as conservative as he was when we served in the White House together.
There's something known in politics as having a permission structure, giving voters a permission structure, which is to say, Kristen, it's not your fault. You did the right thing by voting how you did. What you have to understand now, though, is things are different. Now, are you going to convince Republicans who like Donald Trump that his views on the world are similar to Joe Biden's when it comes to the debt and the deficit? That's a very difficult thing to do. I think fundamentally what Trump's rivals have to hope happens is that voters on the Republican side, they see this, just the toll that these legal actions are taking on the possibility of Donald Trump not just winning election, but even if he wins, being effective. And you can see that argument starting to bubble up a little bit. Yeah, Donald Trump, even if he wins, he's going to get to Washington. They're going to keep investigating him. The media's going to go after him. The deep state's going to try to undermine him. He did a great job. This is what his rivals will say. He did a great job, but he can't do it now. And if you want a successor to Donald Trump who will be a real conservative, pick me. That's what Mike Pence is saying there.
Yeah, and I think it'll be notable to see if anyone lays that out that clearly, because right now what we are seeing are these very subtle inferences about that. Amy Walter, thank you so much. Great to see you as always. Still to come, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu saying he's moving forward with that controversial plan to overhaul Israel's judicial system. We'll delve into that. You're watching Meet the Press now. Well, we were going to talk about Israel. We're having a little bit of a technical problem out in London, so we have brought Amy Walter back, who's going to keep the conversation going.
We'll try to do that.
Amy, I want to talk about President Biden in a moment, but I do want to do one more beat on the Republican primary field, which is Ron DeSantis. An article out today which really delved into the role that his wife plays in his political world.
That's right.
She's very involved. This is not new. We've seen the secret weapon spouse before.
Yes.
But how significant is it with Ron DeSantis, someone who has been criticized for not really mastering the retail part of retail politics?
Right. And that they are a very insular campaign.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be really the bigger question going forward is, you know, they have been really successful. The two of them with a very small team at being able to win a seat in Congress, win a very competitive primary for governor, win twice as governor. That's a great track record. But running for president, that is in a totally different tier of stress and difficulty. And can they keep just to themselves, or do they need to widen their sphere in terms of people coming in and helping and giving advice and having that advice being taken?
Big picture, I mean, you and I have talked about this before. It is still early. I mean, back in this time in 2016, Jeb Bush was ahead in the polls.
I know. The big difference, right? The difference is that Donald Trump, for all intents and purposes, is like an incumbent, right? I mean, he was the former president of the United States.
Right.
Now, what is, I think, the question mark over all of this is he was the president of the United States. He's still popular among Republicans, and yet we have an indictment. Right? Potential trial, potentially more indictments coming down the pike. What is this going to really look like? We've never seen anything like this, Kristen, in all of our time covering politics. So nobody can actually tell you what this is going to look like by the time we hit summer of next year.
Let me ask you about President Biden. He was in Philadelphia over the weekend. He's out west now. Doesn't get any friendlier than Philadelphia. What do you make of his strategy of hitting the campaign trail now?
Well, I think he's got to make a message right now. If you're Joe Biden, you're looking at your numbers, even among Democrats, to say to those who are a little ambivalent, to those who are a little stressed, thinking, I don't know, is he going to be able to have a robust campaign for president given his age? Say, I'm absolutely going to do that. I'm going to show you every week here that I can do this job.
All right. Amy Walter, thank you very much.
Welcome.
We appreciated this
Happy to be back.
extended edition, and thank you for being with us this hour. I'm back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.